So this panel will deal with issues that have to do with sociology, demography, and urban planning. I am Claudia Valeggia. I'm a professor here at Yale in the Department of Anthropology and in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese. And I'm also the chair of the Council on Latin American and Iberian Studies. And I am very proud of being part of the organization, together with the Ministry of Education in Brazil, of this very productive gathering. I see a lot of different voices with a common interest and a lot of potential for synergy and collaboration and understanding each other's view of the relationship between Brazil and the US. And we were just chatting with Professor Logan about the different way the presenters took the question, the discussion question prompt that we provided. And that's an interesting feature of this gathering, and I hope you have enjoyed that freedom as well. So for today, our discussion question was regarding studies on urban formation and Brazilian environmental challenges from the US perspective. What are the best ways in which US researchers can contribute to the debate in Brazil? Myself, I am an anthropologist that works with indigenous people in northern Argentina, and I'm not an expert on issues of urban formation, but I am a very direct witness of these movements and how the movement towards urban settings of indigenous people change their lifestyle, change their health, their political economy, the way they relate to each other. So I'm very curious to hear the panelists today, Professor Fischer and Professor Logan, about how they see things happening and happened in the past with Brazil. So we are very honored to have here Professor John Logan, who is a professor of sociology at Brown University. Dr. Logan completed his PhD in sociology at the University of California, Berkeley, and now he's at Brown and is the co-author, along with Harvey Mollock, of Urban Fortunes, the Political Economy of Place. His most recent edited book is Diversity and Disparities, which was published in 2015. His main ongoing research uses contemporary and historical census data to study changes in residential patterns with a particular emphasis on immigrants and racial minorities. One set of studies is taking advantage of recently available 100% census microdata in the period of 1880 to 1940, mapping people's location and examining patterns of neighborhood change and racial, ethnic, and class segregation. So I welcome you to your presentation. So we're going to have Professor Logan's presentation, followed by Professor Fischer's presentation, and then we'll open up the floor for questions.
Okay. Good. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I rarely get to hear in such a short period of time so many people talking about so many different issues from so many different perspectives. And even in my own university, I don't get to hear much from people in other departments. You know, we were quite siloed. So that's been interesting. I am not a Brazilianist, and so when I first was asked would I be interested in coming to this meeting, I wondered, well, why would I do that, and why would anybody ask me to do that? And what piqued my interest was the way that this question was formulated, which I understood something to do about how working from an American perspective and from an American perspective, what is the contribution that could be made to people in Brazil who may be dealing with some parallel kinds of questions to the ones that we work with routinely in the U.S. And so I'm going to do that, but I'm going to do it, first of all, oh, yes. So that's a good question. I'm going to talk about it, but I'm going to talk about it not from the point of view of what I have to contribute to Brazilian urban studies, but rather an entirely different context, because while not a Brazilianist, I am a China person, and I've been working on China for quite a long time, and dealing very much with exactly the question of, as an American with certain kinds of resources and reputation and ability to mobilize things, what is it that I could contribute, and to watch how that's changed over the years. I'd like to talk about that just primarily as a way to stimulate your own thinking about what you take for granted and what questions you might ask about your relationship with Brazil. The other thing that I want to do, and this really does have to do with making a contribution to Brazilian urban studies, is I want to describe to you what is stated on this title: Mapped Data for Rio and Sao Paulo for 2000 and 2010. I want to describe a system which is a contribution to the research data infrastructure of mapped data at a very fine spatial scale on quite a lot of indicators that can be used to study just exactly what is going on with respect to urban change and redevelopment in these cities over the past decade. And I'd like to show that to you. If there is any positive result from this presentation for me, any benefit at all, it will be because one of you tells a friend that, by the way, did you know that there's this system available and you can use it and it might be good for your classes or for your own research? Here's the web page. And I just one person, that would be enough to make me happy. But let me talk first of all about this question in general, about how an American social scientist connects up with another country's background. And for many of you with Brazil, you have the connection that you are yourself Brazilian, or you have a Brazilian connection of some kind. You're married to a Brazilian, your parents, or something like you're sort of semi-Brazilian. With respect to China, I have nothing about China. I don't even speak Chinese. So that's, I'm kind of an odd person to be making contributions to Chinese urban sociology. But I had the opportunity in 1986, at a time when sociology was just being reintroduced as a discipline in Chinese universities, to be part of a program that my university, I was at the university at Albany, State University of New York at that time, where we developed a joint PhD program between our university and Nankai University to recruit the first class of PhD students in a Chinese university to get through a program. And several of us went over to Tianjin and taught courses, and then after 3 years, we brought everybody to Albany to work on a dissertation, and most of them got PhDs. And I think they all became professors because they were the earliest possible professors of sociology in China. So that was the starting point. And obviously there was a big gap there, quite a vacuum. The chair of the sociology department at the time, he was the party's secretary, and that was his qualification for the job. He was actually a philosopher of Chinese version Mao Marxism, and so that's what he contributed to sociology. Now Nankai University has a very strong program and is capable of growing its own PhDs within the university. It's an entirely different situation. So the question is, how could I contribute? And one way, of course, and we've talked about exchanges, was by helping to develop the very bright Chinese students who came to the United States to get a PhD in sociology. And that was also the way in which I was able to get some research done myself and get access to data and have people could explain things to me. And so it was certainly mutually beneficial. But this was also a period when in sociology in China, the thing they were interested in was population control. This is the 1980s. Population control was the sociological question of the time. And I wasn't too interested in that. I wanted people to be interested in questions about urban development. I thought there were a lot of good questions in a Chinese context that would be worth pursuing. And I helped to develop, I established an Urban China research network, and we got a grant from the Mellon Foundation. That made a big difference. And we were in a position to give dissertation research grants to, over about 5 years, to 100 young people. Very small amounts, but at that time, even a very small amount of money was a lot of money in China. And in fact, I'd say that the financial relationship between us and China was very much that they needed that resource. It made a big difference to them, and so I found a way that we could offer it. The interesting thing in that respect is that now, and the Urban China Research Network is quite mature now. Most of the people we supported at that time are the chairs of their departments of major universities, and it was very successful in terms of developing a generation of well-trained scholars. So there was that. But the big change is that I came to realize that there's no money anymore in the United States to support urban China research. The money's in China. And so everything that we're doing now is oriented to taking advantage of the willingness of people there to support research and their capability of writing proposals and getting money from the government and doing studies that make a real difference in the local context. So I've been interested in the question, well, now what is my role? And it continues to be an important role, but it's not financial, and it's not that I'm going to teach them the rudiments of sociological methods or how to work with data or even what are the questions that we ask in urban sociology in the United States that are the cutting edge questions, because they all have access to that and they can learn that from their own faculty. Many have gotten PhDs from the US or European universities, but now they're back and running the show in China. So what do I have to offer? And one thing is reputation. That is very helpful in terms of the legitimacy of the work that people say that they want to do and their ability to publish it. If they're able to say that it is sort of in line with what Professor Logan said at his talk last year, or that their legitimacy is a very important ingredient and hardly substitutable. And in the Chinese context, legitimacy is still more abroad than it is within China. And if you want to publish and have it make a difference to your career, it should be in an international journal, not a Chinese-based journal. And that's just the way it is. So if I can help people to publish in international English language journals, that's another way that, it's not my sociology or something, but rather my ability to work with them and mentor them as younger colleagues, the same way I would with students here in the United States. So that's really of value, but it's a secondary component. And so I'm looking forward to the time when the connection between the American input into Chinese urban social science has turned entirely around to the point that now they are innovating their own theories of change, their own idea of what needs to be paid attention to, that they're noticing things that they can discover from their own field work and talking to people and living there that would always have escaped me, but not only me, but even the American-based real China experts who are also working in the field. So I'm curious about whether that kind of a relationship or where in that continuum of a type of relationship Brazilian studies in the US and Brazilian studies in Brazil falls. And what is it that they need? And what is it that we here can contribute? And are they now in the position of how much are they contributing back to us? Okay, so that's one thing I wanted to talk about, and I hope some of you think that that's kind of an interesting question, because many of us are engaged in doing collaborative work, not just because we want to get our work done and publish it, but because we're trying to contribute to the development of a field somewhere else where it needs to be developed. The other thing I want to talk about is this mapping system, and now this is a concrete contribution to research on urban questions in Brazil. And the interesting thing here is that the Iberian, that's how you pronounce it in Portuguese, has been collecting and disseminating all kinds of data for quite a long time. And it's all available on the internet. You can just download it. And they even have map shapefiles somewhere on the internet. And if you knew where it was, and if you knew how to use them, you could download them too, and you could join the data to the map information, and you could do all kinds of place-based, space-based studies of urban change, like where are the favelas, or do poor people actually live in the urban favelas, or do they live outside the city, and to what extent, and how is it changing, and all kinds of questions about segregation and advantage and separation by race, by income, by age, by type of housing, is all available there to study, and it's relatively easy to study if you had the data in the right format. And here's what I found with respect to this, that although it's all available, it's not really available. Because it's hard to get to, it's hard to understand, it's hard to interpret. It's not that it's in Portuguese that it's hard to interpret, because many of us speak Spanish, so we can read it. But to know what actually was being asked and what the meaning of the answers was and what the categories actually are and so on, there's a lot of fine detail that needs to be understood. In addition, it's very hard to know where it is. I had colleagues who said, oh yeah, you can go to their website and you'll find it. So I go to the website and I can't find it. Can you send me a more specific URL? There's shapefiles. Where are the shapefiles? I dare you, any of you, to go find the shapefiles that show what are the boundaries of the setores censitarios of Rio de Janeiro in 2000. And I guarantee it's there, but you'll never find it. So this was the innovation, and I've done this with American data a lot also in the past, but there's a particular need also with Brazilian data. And again, this is one of the things, what can I contribute? I don't think I'm the guy to study urban neighborhood change and segregation and advantage and disadvantage and urban inequality in Brazil. Because I've only been there a couple times, and I hardly know anything. I'm not the guy to do it. But I know how to work with data sets, and I know how to set up dissemination systems and mapping systems and so on, and I can make that kind of a contribution. So here it is. Okay, let's start with this. So an interesting thing about this system is that it's built partly on Google. So if you can see it, this is in Rio. I'm going to show some examples from Rio de Janeiro. And if you can see it, you can see that there's a neighborhood up in the upper right, and there's a neighborhood down in the lower left, and they look pretty different from each other. And if you observe it for a while and think about it for a while, you may be able to figure out what kind of a place are these two kinds of places, which are quite adjacent to each other. And it's at the west end of the Ipanema beach. By the way, I spent a weekend there. It was really nice, you know, with my wife. And we went to the neighborhood on the other side of the hill, and it was also very interesting, but not so nice. So two kinds of settlements, and what do we know about these kinds of settlements? So now I go away from the satellite image to say, and what is the social content or the population composition of these areas? And I've simply mapped what percent in small neighborhood areas of the residents have a college degree. And if you look at this area on the lower left area, it turns out there's two different settlements there, and then some big hills that are kind of in between them. And you say, oh, it's really, really low, like 1%. And then over on the Ipanema side, it's really, really high, like 20 or 30 or 40%. And that's interesting to note the disparity. But if you wanted to look more closely, let's see, what have I done now? Oh yes, at other things about it, not just college degrees, but are there street signs, which is a characteristic of the built environment. And what neighborhood doesn't have street signs on the streets on the whole? And what neighborhood always has street signs? So that's another kind of a characteristic. And we also know, is there piped water? Is there piped gas? Is there litter in the streets? There's a number of kinds of measures about the local environment and infrastructure. Is there regular trash pickup? Do the houses have bathrooms with running water? So the IBGE actually collected all of this kinds of data, but you wouldn't have been able to find it. But now all you have to do is you have to go on here and just choose notice there's a menu here on the upper left. Please choose a category, and I've chosen infrastructure, and under the category, choose a variable, and I chose neighborhood, the percent of neighborhood that has street signs. That's all you have to do. Point and click, and you have the results. Now, I'm going to look more closely at another area nearby. A small part of that, what I was calling Ipanema, is actually Leblon. And the travel guide says, well, okay, that's what it's about. Lovely people. And looking really close, which you can zoom in this map system, really, really close, you see exactly what kind of housing. It's high-rise residential apartments, very uniform, and the kind of thing that you might like to live in if you like tall buildings. And here is a much more zoomed-in image of the area on the other side. Now, you've been in these places. Your students may not have been in these places. And if you'd like to teach them about places like this, then the visual image is really important. For a sociologist, though, I'm interested in things like the college degrees, education level, income level, racial composition, street signs, quality of the environment, and to be able to link those all with the visual images. So now I'm going to look at income in the whole Rio area, a larger area, and this is where, can you see, is there a pointer? Yeah, there's well, I don't know if you can see the point. I'm moving this pointer around. Here's where we were looking, and there's the higher income area, and there's right next to it a much lower income area. But the general story is not about that area around Leblon or Ipanema. The general story is about there's sort of central Rio, and then there's the whole periphery, and the distinction between the two, and it's really very apparent when you study a map. And we can look further into it. For example, I've zoomed into a rich area at the end of the beach, and there is, at the end of it, there's a little neighborhood where I can click on it and it'll tell me that the income is only 2,300 somethings, and the percent black and brown in that same area is 53%, whereas generally in that part of the city, the income level is 30 or 40,000 instead of 3,000, and the percent black and brown instead of 53%, it's maybe 10%. So we have very clear, very simple ways to describe the social and economic disparities among places very close to one another. And because I've used up all of my time, I'm not going to be able to show you all the rest of the images, but there's more, and there's more. And there's not just Rio, but there's also Sao Paulo. And it's not just 2010, it's also 2000, so we can see how things are changing. And this is a list of all of the characteristics that we have in the map system that you might think would be interesting to know about. So a basis for research, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Logan. And now it's a pleasure to introduce Brodwyn Fischer. Professor Fischer is a historian of Brazil and Latin America, especially interested in cities, citizenship, law, migration, race, and social inequality. And from 2014 to 18, she was my fellow chair of the Center for Latin American Studies, and she will return to the directorship next year. So I was very interested in her current book, Understanding Inequality in Post-Abolition Brazil, which explores the limits of egalitarian and emancipatory politics in Recife, which came to be seen as both the capital of Brazilian underdevelopment and the incubator of some of the country's most innovative social and cultural movements. So please join me in welcoming Professor Fischer.
I'm very grateful for the invitation to be here, to Claudia, to David, to the Brazilian Ministry of Education. It's been really enlightening to hear people come at the issue of Brazilian studies from so many different angles. It's really an experience that I've learned a lot from. And I'm in an odd position on this panel, in a sense, because I am a historian, but I've made a point in the most recent phase of my work to try to be a historian who really crosses over into discussions of current day events, and particularly issues that have to do with urbanity, with the right to the city, with race, and with citizenship and the meaning of the law in Brazilian society. And so I was asked here to talk about cities in particular, but I won't be able to quite shake my identity as a historian, in that I'm going to subject you to a little bit of background about the relationship between U.S. and Brazilian researchers when it comes to the history of cities and the history of the study of cities. Before I go on to talk about some of the things that I think have really been gained from those relationships, and some of the things that I think looking forward are especially important for us to prioritize, both here in the United States, but also I hope that people in a position to exercise some degree of control over the direction of Brazilian institutions, I hope that these observations will be interesting for you as well. All right, so I was interested in the formulation of the question for this panel, because it was, when I first saw it, I thought, well, this is an interesting question, because it's really asking, unlike some of the other formulations for other panels, it was asking us to say, what has the U.S. brought to the study of Brazilian cities, or what does the U.S. bring to the study of Brazilian cities? And as a good guilty imperialist, I immediately thought, oh, that's the wrong question, because of course it's not what we bring, it's a circular, it's an exchange. But then I came to think a little bit harder, and I realized, well, that's actually really an important question, because if I'm thinking about the allocation of resources in Brazil, if I'm thinking about educational policy in Brazil, where no matter where I am on the political spectrum in Brazil, it actually matters to think about, what does a relationship with institutions in the United States actually mean? What is gained from a Brazilian perspective from having these kinds of relationships? So with the caveat that, of course, as a researcher, I see these relationships as being circular, as being exchanges, in no way being a one-way street, I will focus my comments a little bit more on the question of what U.S. researchers have brought to the table, but also have done maybe unconsciously to influence the field of urban studies in Brazil. So to begin, I'm going to be very schematic. I have enough of a sociologist in me to do that, to put things in categories and try to make them clearer. And so I want to talk about at least 3 ways in which I believe that U.S. influence has been especially important in Brazil, really since the beginnings of the fields of urban studies and sociology in the early 20th century in that country. The first is the most abstract, and I want to put it on the table because I think it's actually very important for people who think about urban studies. And that is that the entire conception of what a city is still to this day very much a North Atlantic construction. And that's a problem because most people who live in cities do not live in the North Atlantic. They mostly live in what we incorrectly call the global South. So most people who live in cities that are actually very much unlike the cities that have created the paradigm for what a city is supposed to look like. So to make that more concrete, whether you're thinking historically or whether you're thinking in the present tense, there are certain both material and symbolic signs and symbols that we associate with what a city is. So we think of a city, we think of sidewalks, we think of sewer systems, we think of electricity, we think of electric lights, we think of neon signs, we think of cinemas, transportation. As we move toward the present tense, we think of soaring skyscrapers. Maybe our vision changes to Asian cities rather than the US or Europe. But there is this notion that the city is part of a kind of normative, architectural, spatial, and social evolution. And in fact, in all of the stories, the modernizing narratives of the 19th and 20th centuries within the field of sociology, the city is seen as very much an incubator of a certain vision of what the modern is, right? And this is a vision that is grounded in Marx and Weber and in many generations before them, actually, but it's a kind of evolutionary notion of unitary human progress, where the city is in some ways defined as the most advanced stage of a particular form of human evolution. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that that was always, even in the North Atlantic, a complete fantasy. That is, that cities are much more than that. They're not just the sidewalks and the sewers and the soaring buildings and the cinemas. Cities are also, in the United States and Europe, as well as in the global South, they are shanty towns. They are forms of violence that are based not on law and regulation, but on extra-legal forms of power. They are places where networks of relational power are as important as the kind of liberal legal institutions that we like to think about when we think about cities. All of those other things exist in cities, no matter where you're looking at it in the world. But in a place like Brazil, of course, the proportion between the part of the city that looks like that North Atlantic ideal and the part of the city that is shaped by forces that we really don't even have very good sociological categories for is much greater. And so I think from the very beginning, in the beginning of the 20th century, there's a fundamentally negative influence that comes from the U.S. on the study of cities that has to do with the notion that the idea of the city that is being projected to the rest of the world is one that does not necessarily correspond to what cities already were in those other parts of the world, and it doesn't necessarily correspond to what those cities should or can or want to be. And so I put that out there as a sort of as a dimension of the relationship between the United States and Brazil when it comes to the production of cities, because I think it's important that actors on all sides of those exchanges be very self-critical about what it means to define the city in a narrow way, what it means to accept as paradigmatic a definition of a city that is so limited, and what all of us can do to actually change those modes of thinking about what a city ought to be to something that can actually be more productive in most of the contexts in most of the world. And so that's kind of a general theoretical comment on the problem that I wanted to begin with. But from there, I'm going to get much more concrete, and I want to talk a little bit about the really very interesting history of the creation of urban studies in the United States and Brazil, and the ways in which those things have been interdependent, and the ways in which certain kinds of ideas, and it's not simply theoretical ideas, but also methodologies and notions about how cities ought to be studied and what techniques ought to be used to study them, how those kinds of things have both been influenced in Brazil by the United States, but how there's also been a certain amount of circulation of those ideas and feedback from Brazilian researchers into the United States. So I think of this second vector as being direct and scholarly and technical. It involves the creation and the translation of methodologies and paradigms that were generally created in the North Atlantic in the United States, and in Brazil. France is, of course, also a very important source, England to a smaller degree. But the creation, translation of those methodologies and paradigms, but then the processes through which those methodologies and paradigms arrive in a place like Brazil, and the processes through which they are adapted and actually become key to the creation of urban studies as a field in various Brazilian institutions. So I want to give a very quick and very schematic summary of that. We can actually go all the way back to the beginning of the 20th century and see these exchanges happening in things like censusing techniques. And actually, as John was speaking, I'll put in a plug for Brazil, the availability of Brazilian data, not just in the present tense, but going all the way back to 1900. I'm working with a map right now from 1907 that is one of the first technical maps of Recife, and it is the only map in the world from that time that our international collective has been able to find that actually maps informality. It maps shacks at that very, very early date. And so there's really a wealth of this kind of information to work with over a long period of time, obviously not digitized, but it's certainly something that lots of research could be done about. But already at that point, in terms of conversations about things like mapping and censuses, there was already a pretty healthy dialogue between U.S. researchers and those in the United States. But of course, one of the crucial moments in the 20th century in terms of exchange was the rise of the Chicago School of Sociology, and the direct involvement of some of the members of that school in researching in Brazil, but also in creating some of the first social science institutions in Brazil, particularly the USP, the University of Sao Paulo, but also faculties in Rio, and in a more indirect way, institutes that ended up creating the first anthropology and sociology programs in the country. And Brazilian intellectuals during the 1920s and 30s were very, very deeply influenced by the Chicago School, also by the forms of anthropology and what eventually became urban anthropology that were being generated in universities like Columbia with Franz Boas, but also being really disseminated among anthropology departments all over the United States during those years. And so if we read somebody like Gilberto Freire, who is, of course, known mainly for his ideas or his supposed ideas, very few people who talk about Freire actually read him, but there is, he's known for his ideas about race. But if you read his books are actually as much about cities as they are about race. And the Chicago School was very influential, particularly in his thinking about evolutionary succession and the notion of how you adapt that to a city that, rather than having inner city neighborhoods and suburbs, has mocambos or shacks, and then the gradual creation of formal neighborhoods. And he has some very interesting writing where he uses the Chicago School to discuss those kinds of ideas. So you can see the Chicago School in Freire. You can see, of course, Donald Pearson, who's probably the most important figure in the direct transfer of these ideas. He did a study of racial dynamics in Bahia, in Salvador, Bahia, but also very important studies of the city of Sao Paulo. And he was fundamental in setting up the first social science institutions in Brazil and Sao Paulo to really think from a social scientific perspective about the question of the city. You also have people like Ruth Landis, who took some of the anthropological insights that were being generated from these schools into her study of Candomblé in Salvador. And there were many Brazilians who adapted these ideas. L.A. de Costa Pinto in Rio is one of the most important of these. He and Pearson were two of the very first people to begin to do some of the kind of work that John was talking about in recent data, to try to take, given available statistics, statistics about race and space and occupation and circulation, and to begin to create a sociology of urban inequality, and particularly racial inequality in Brazilian cities. And so the very earliest iterations of thinking about race and space in Brazil were actually coming about directly because of interchanges between US and Brazilian academics. Subsequent to that, you, of course, see the continuation of U.S. influence on studies of race. Somebody like Florestan Fernandes, one of the things that's not known about much of his early work is that it was actually modeled on studies of Chicago. Black Metropolis is a very well-known book in the United States. The structure of Florestan Fernandes' first book about race in Sao Paulo is very, very similar to Black Metropolis, and you can see that he's directly pulling many of the methodologies and ways of thinking about urban space from that place. And then you can go all the way up to the present tense that someone like Ed Teles is taking many of the much more sophisticated modern techniques of being able to map certain kinds of racial inequality over time and working with an enormous team of Brazilian and international researchers to try to gain insights about urban space and segregation. And there are many, many Brazilians who are adapting those techniques now. And so from the 1930s forward, particularly on the issue of race and cities, the U.S. influence, I think, has been very important. There was also a moment where U.S. researchers were very important in transforming debates about urban informality in Brazil. And so at the time that Brazil was the equivalent of what perhaps China is now, or certain Indian and African cities are now in various countries in Africa, Nigeria maybe most particularly, Brazil was in a way occupying that role, partly because of issues that were brought up a while ago about Brazil's very particular position in the Cold War. But the notion that the very rapid urbanization that was happening in Brazil and other Latin American countries was in some way a test of the power of modernity and of the ability of the West to withstand the communist threat, all kinds of rhetoric that I used to say was old-fashioned, but of course it's now come back into circulation, so I'm not quite sure what to do with that. But U.S. researchers who went to Brazil to try to understand the suddenly visible phenomena of the favelas were very important in creating the fields of urban anthropology and sociology that have really come to be one of the most important and dynamic aspects of the Brazilian social sciences in subsequent years. And there's a lot of detail to those interactions that I won't go into, but they certainly weren't the first people to talk about favelas. You have the myths of marginality that Janice Perlman made famous in the United States. Those were already being denounced in Brazil in 1904, and subsequent generations, every generation has a debate about the myth of marginality. And so it wasn't that U.S. researchers were bringing these things for the first time to Brazil, but they were giving a certain kind of visibility to these issues in a way that they had not had transnationally before, and also bringing quite a lot of research funds and support for research and validation of research that would have been very difficult, particularly during the military rules years, to carry out if it hadn't been for this relationship with the United States. All right, so in the current day, of course, there are many, many other exchanges that go back over time. I haven't even mentioned architecture and modernism, which is, of course, a whole other set of issues that involve aesthetic and art history questions, as well as questions of urban planning. But there's also a long history of exchanges about legal frameworks and rights to the city legislation, many, many areas where there's been this very, very fruitful convergence of Brazilian and U.S. research, but where, especially toward the beginning of the 20th century, U.S. paradigms and ideas had a very formative impact, not only on individual researchers, but also on the institutional structure of urban studies in Brazil. All right, so in the time that remains, I just want to very quickly talk about some of the things that I think have been gained over time from this relationship. I'd like to begin by saying that I think that there are certain structures that were built in the United States. They're not necessarily U.S. structures, because actually many of the architects were immigrants. And so to say that this was something that came from the U.S. and was sort of broadcast out to the world would actually be incorrect. I mean, these are sets of ideas or approaches or methodologies that were mainly created by immigrants and the children of immigrants in U.S. institutions. And I think one of the reasons that many of these institutions were so dynamic is because they were very diverse and cosmopolitan and implicitly comparative structures. That is, even when the thinking was all being done in the United States, it was always being done in a way that was implicitly comparative with other parts of the world that researchers had come from, right? And so there is in the very culture of this early sociology and anthropology a kind of cosmopolitanism that I think was really important for the international development of the field of urban studies. There was also a certain emphasis, particularly in the Chicago School, of methods that were empirical and inductive. And the notion was not so much that you would begin with a kind of paradigm and then you would see how it was applied around the world, but it was that you would send your researchers out to the rest of the world. Not only, I mean, there was certainly an imperial dimension to that, but also the notion that you can only really create universal knowledge if you're having the input of all kinds of knowledge that is built from the bottom up. And so there was an attitude in somebody like Donald Pearson of not only wanting to go to Brazil and study Brazil as an object, but also the notion that there were structures of knowledge, although they might not have used this exact language, that they would absorb and that would become part of the universal knowledge of sociology. And so there's a kind of empirical, cosmopolitan approach, an inductive approach that I think was really key to some of the main strengths of these approaches. And I think that there's also a certain kind of multidisciplinary bent that's not in any way unique to the United States, but that has been very important in urban studies. And I want to use a very contemporary example to sort of make this clear for you. So we have at Chicago a new institute that's called the Mansueto Institute for Urban Innovation. And it's very controversial on our campus. There are lots of good things. There are lots of things that people criticize about it. But one of the more interesting things is that the head of this institute is a man named Luis Betancourt, who is Portuguese national. He speaks Brazilian. He also speaks Portuguese, who was trained as a theoretical physicist and is housed in the Department of Ecology and Evolution. So already there you can see that there's a kind of radical interdisciplinary approach, which may or may not work in the long run, but that is being brought to this new Institute for Urban Studies in Chicago. And that is in some ways the modern iteration of this interdisciplinary approach that I think has been very characteristic of the strongest moments of US dynamic production about cities in the past. And to make this even more concrete, one of Luis Betancourt's areas of research is to take mathematical ideas about topology and apply them to exactly the maps. It's almost serendipitous that John showed us the maps that he did, because if you remember the grid of Leblon and then the twisty map of Vidigal that was right next to Leblon in that map, what Luis does is he takes a mathematical geometric approach to those maps. And he says that if we take one of the main challenges to the regularization of urban land, which is how can you keep people in the place where they're living, so don't disrupt their lives and their social networks and their communities, but yet give them access to the physical aspects of urban living that are important to health and safety and sanitation and all the rest. So streets, water systems, all of these kind of basic things of urban life. One of the main problems in doing that kind of work is that Rio's favelas are full of twists and turns and alleys, and it's virtually impossible to bring streets into an area like that without evicting people. And so many of the conflicts that have happened in Rio have been over this issue of how can you regularize without disrupting. So he takes a mathematical approach, and he has built these incredible data sets where he basically creates a menu of options of the most efficient ways to make sure that every house has adequate access to transportation networks that we might call streets. And so what he does is just model a million different ways that you could bring sort of adequate access to mobility, to urban mobility, to one of these favelas. But what's more interesting still is that he's now implementing this in Cape Town and in Mumbai. And he's working with an organization called Slums International, which is known internationally for being a very radical grassroots organization that is completely against removals, completely against authoritarian impositions of urban planning. And what they like about this is that these maps can be taken to community meetings, and they can go through in this very concrete way. These are the options for getting us to a point where we can have an adequate amount of access to the city without disrupting, while disrupting the minimal number of people within the community. So that's a contemporary example of this kind of interdisciplinarity that I think, when it works at its best, can actually be what is most thrilling about the field of urban studies in general. But it involves bringing all of these fields together in a way that doesn't happen very often, either in the United States or in Brazil. All right, so those are some of the things that I think have been benefits. I know that I'm out of time, but let me just very quickly run through a few more. I think that there is a inherent quality in the research of foreigners in other places. Tocqueville was brought up a little bit earlier as an example of this. Foreigners can sometimes see things that are so normalized for somebody that lives in a society that they don't seem worth studying, right? When you go to someplace else, everything is strange. And when you live in a society, everything is normal. And so any healthy society has a certain amount of interchange between foreigners and nationals. In the United States, one of our biggest problems is that we no longer have that cosmopolitanism necessarily in our policymaking circles that thinks that the way that things work here aren't the way that they have to work. And so I think that kind of injection of a foreign perspective can be very important. There's also the valorization of subjects that are understood as being taboo within a given context. And so in Brazil, race is actually probably the most important example of this, that it's no accident that the issue of urban racial spatial inequality has again and again been the focus of the studies of foreigners or of people who have studied in the United States. And part of that is exactly what John was saying, that if somebody who is famous and foreign is bringing this to the center of the table, it's very difficult to marginalize it and say this is not an issue in our country, right? And so there's a certain kind of exchange and reinforcement that can happen through that. This is also true about informality as a subject. Urban informality as a serious subject of urban study, I think, is something that can be reinforced by foreigners. There's also a very practical dimension of this relationship, which is during the military dictatorship, of course, the United States was a safe haven and a safe space for researchers, including researchers of race, who did not have the academic freedom, the freedom of speech, the funding to continue their research within Brazilian institutions. And I think it's very, very important for us in the U.S. to take that role seriously. That is, that to the degree that we can be that for people whose free speech is being threatened in their own country, and to the extent that sometimes we need that ourselves and can take advantage of places like Mexico, places like Brazil, that's a very important part of that kind of exchange. There's also a fostering of university cultures that are diverse, separate from politics and business, free, and not-for-profit. And I think the U.S. has had a very important role in fostering those kinds of institutions in Brazil. I'm myself trying to be optimistic, but very concerned about the future of those particular qualities in education. Education that is not only for the sake of entrepreneurship, education that really does have a very deep focus on knowledge production and free speech, and that is accessible to many, many sectors of the population, no matter what the race or the socioeconomic background. And I think that there's a lot that we can do from here to admire the policies that have been put in place in Brazil and try to encourage them. And the final thing that I want to say is that I think that there's a very important role that most of us try to take on when we are U.S. American citizens who work in Brazil, and that is to recognize that usually the academic work that we are doing about Brazil, when we're really, really lucky, we make a contribution to those fields in a real way, in an intellectual way, in a deep way. When we're not so lucky, our best function in the intellectual world is actually to some extent as people who are able to translate the incredibly rich and valuable work that is taking place in Brazil's universities and think tanks and intellectual institutions, and as people who can help to diffuse those ideas in the United States. And I think that the problem of translation is one that we often tend to minimize, because we say, oh no, so many Brazilians speak English and they publish in English, and we've really gone past the time where there's really a very important role for translation. But the fact is that both Brazilians and people from the US who study Brazil, there's a lot to translation that goes beyond the literal linguistic translation. In order to make people in the United States understand the meaning of the very rich debates that happen within Brazil, you need intermediate figures. And those can be Brazilians with long experience in the United States or in Europe, or they can be Europeans or people in the US who have long experience in Brazil. But you need these intermediary figures who can demonstrate to their own culture, in my case, the importance and the validity of the knowledge that is being generated in Brazilian institutions for universal debates. Because many, many Brazilians don't need any help with that at all, and they're already the most important intellectual figures throughout the world. But in my own fields of urban studies and history, there are so many brilliant people whose work is unknown outside of Brazil because of the barrier, because of the linguistic barrier, but also because Brazil, ironically, has such a fantastic university culture that people do the same thing they do in the United States. They speak to each other, and they don't speak to an outside world. And so I think there's a very important function that we ought to play in the United States in that collective task of translation and valorization. To close, I'd like to say that one of the only reasons that I ever went to work in Brazil, and one of the only reasons that I ever loved to have Brazilian visitors, both faculty and students, come through the University of Chicago, the reasons that I stay engaged with the country, the reasons for that is not just that I like the beach, although I do. It's not just that whenever I go to Brazil, I just have a feeling of being in a place where I want to belong. It's not just that. It's also that of all of the countries that I've worked in outside of the United States, when I went to Brazil, there was so much at a purely intellectual level that I realized that I had to learn. And this was true in terms of the level of the intellectual debates that I was seeing in think tanks and universities. It was true in terms of a scholarship that it has taken me 25 years to feel like I have a grasp of, because it's such an enormous and complex and diverse set of scholarship. And it's true in terms of the pure erudition that is such a quality of a really good Brazilian education, in which many people from the U.S. actually can feel quite ignorant when they're exposed to it. And all of those things are the result of educational institutions that, at their very best, at the university level, really work well. And I think that I share with many of my colleagues in the United States a hope and a commitment to trying to make sure that Brazil continues to be a place that is so generative of ideas that transform the way that we universally understand issues like cities and inequality and law and history. And part of that is really being vigilant to make sure that in the transformation of the things that don't work about a system, there's also value given to the things that really do work. And so I wanted to end by just I hope sharing or articulating something that most of us share, which is the most important dimension of the exchange at a university level between the United States and Brazil is the very high quality of the thinking and the research and the production that's happening in Brazil. It wouldn't happen if it wasn't such an interesting exchange, and it's really important for that to stretch into the future.
I thank Professor Logan and Professor Fischer for their presentation and open the floor for questions.
Let me start. I want to congratulate Brodwyn on her presentation. It was really an unusually sophisticated overview, and I don't often hear that at conferences. So, thank you.
Let me just start with a provocation. What if we posit that collaboration is not a good, that it's not an unmitigated good? My colleagues, sociologists of knowledge, tell me that in certain types of problem-solving research, teams to design a fast algorithm, it can be good to separate teams of researchers at the beginning, have 4 or 5 separate teams that do not communicate, and only bring them into communication at the end stage of the process. We have a tendency, I think, in the name of academic freedom, in the name of untrammeled communication, to assume that it's always great that everyone should be talking all the time. So moving from my provocation to the kind of collaboration that we know and that we need, what could strike a balance between what's good in national or local or university scientific communities, let's call them that, and the cosmopolitan scientific communities or networks that we join?
Well, I'll say something about that, and then I'll turn it over to Brodwyn, who I think will do a better job to bring it down to the Brazilian case. First of all, we don't organize ourselves around a project in the social sciences. We have 10,000 or 20, I don't know how many thousand people working on different kinds of things. And even if I limit it to urban studies, then we have at least 1,000 people who are really, really active and doing something, and somewhat know what each other is doing, somewhat are influenced by what the other people are doing, and so on. We're really very, very disconnected. And the connections that do exist are often very much on a local level, certainly within national communities, but within national communities, even within a particular network within that country usually. So mostly what we have to begin with is separate from the beginning, disjointed teams working on, but not necessarily on the same project. So it's so unlike this idea that you set up with your provocation. But I want to take it further too. And so, well, what can be good and what can be bad about it? So what can be bad about it is the degree to which these little networks are insulated from each other and just don't know what's being done by people elsewhere. Especially, I think, between like sociologists and economists and anthropologists. Like, we tend not to read each other's work unless it becomes really, high reputation work, and then you read it and, oh, that's interesting, but then kind of put it aside because it's not, so the disciplinary thing. But in addition, we have divisions among ourselves about theoretical orientation. Some urban sociologists would be very upset to hear the Chicago School talked about in terms of something that ever had any positive influence at all in the world. Anyway, so there are these kinds of divisions, right? And that create an inability of us to talk to each other and learn from each other. And so I'm going to say from the very beginning, given how fragmented our world is, everything that we can do to push for just a little bit more coordination and collaboration. Now, I want to say just one more thing about how it can work badly, and that is when it gets to be within, we have power structures within academia. We have power structures, networks. And it would be possible to imagine a world in which, for example, all of the Brazilian social scientists have relatively little power, and they're guided by non-Brazilians who have a lot of power and a lot of resources and a lot of influence. And you could imagine such a world. In fact, the world might have been like that at some time. In the Italian academic system, where the professor controls everything, and if you're lucky, eventually he'll die and you can be a professor. This is kind of a bad world. A more egalitarian world, a world in which more people have access to the raw materials that are required to do stuff. In history, to have all the materials digitized. In demography, to have all the census data transcribed and available in an easy form to get to. That's what I look for, a democratization of the capacity to do work. And that's very hard to achieve, especially in an Anglophone-dominated world. So I'll give you a chance. Get on that soapbox.
I'm going to try to be very, very brief. I definitely accept the provocation, and actually I think in some ways that's why I began with the first idea that I began with. That is that when we have a constantly connected conversation, there's a tendency for the power dynamics of intellectual production to create a conversation that's based on ideas that make more sense for one area of the world than for another. And so that's one of the dangers of too much communication, is that we end up with the common language becomes paradigms that are generated one place and don't apply to other places. And so I think that's one of the biggest risks. But I think that actually the ideal balance in some ways is one that in the best of circumstances we actually have in urban studies now. That is that you have a place like the Centro de Estudos da Metrópole, which is a Sao Paulo think tank on urban issues, very interdisciplinary, really brilliant people, Gabriel Feltran, Eduardo Marques, really wonderful social scientific thinkers in Brazil. And they're developing categories of analysis and information that really are very different than something that you would come up with if you were thinking from the United States or from Europe. And yet they are networked enough that they're able to broadcast and translate those ideas so that they are put into circulation. And the reason that they can develop the ideas that are so different is because they've come through a system where there is support for domestic knowledge production at a rich and intense level. And when you have that kind of support, what it means is that the place that you come from ends up being able to contribute to international conversations on an equal footing. It's not people who don't have research resources who are talking to people who do. It's people who are coming from positions of equal resources and equal advantage. And so I think the best way to avoid that particular danger is to just make sure that there's a very robust system in every place that's participating in the conversation. And that's the equivalent of separating people into groups first, right? You come up through your educational system in such a way that you're able to develop your own way of understanding the world before you end up in this conversation with other places.
Okay. I guess just to add to that, one of the things that seems to me that was responsible for creating that infrastructure in Brazil was not just investments in higher education, which happened substantially over the past few years, but also investments or a lot of care for some development policies in areas like racial equality, social development, and urban development, because when you have need in the government for knowledge on how to tackle some issues and advance some policies, I guess that creates a lot of excitement in the academic community, and that galvanizes a lot of the energy that's available down there. I mean, how do you see the future for Brazil given changes that seem to be happening?
I think that's a topic for at least a year of discussions. I mean, I think that you've absolutely pinpointed it. It comes down to it's not only whether or not there'll be some kind of constitutional amendment that changes free access to education or whether there will be any repeal of affirmative action. It's not just a legislative question, but it's also in a system where the state has been such an important financer of research and where state agencies are responsible for so much of the research time that people spend, not only in public universities but also in private universities, the question of what kind of contract work will be available, what kinds of projects will be funded, what kind of knowledge will be encouraged, I think that's absolutely fundamental. And I don't think anyone has an answer in terms of, I mean, certainly most of my friends are very worried about the availability of funding for the kinds of projects that are understood as being a political anathema to the government that's coming in. I hope that they're wrong, but I think it's a very substantial worry, and it is a place I think where the U.S. can play a very concrete role if that happens. That is similar to what happened when the Ford Foundation published research on race and cities and Brazilian society in the 1970s and 80s. That is that there's a place for international funding to keep going some of the projects that are the most dynamic and the most vital to Brazilian society. And if things go in a direction where vital research is being cut off for political reasons, then I think that's a really important thing for us to think about from this perspective.
I'd like to just mention a different context, and I'll go back to the Chinese case. I mentioned earlier that when I first went to China, sociology was understood by the government to be understanding how to control the population growth and how to maintain the one-child family, and that was it. Now, the government is interested in income inequality and in the marginalization of rural urban migrants as key social issues. They cloak it in discussions with words like social harmony, and they have their way of talking about it. But this is what they're really interested in, and they're supporting. They created the Tsinghua University Sociology Department specifically to have a mechanism for focusing research on social inequality. And it's pervasive now throughout the system. So the conditions under this particular authoritarian but worried about maintaining itself into the future regime are really very good for a progressive sociology. 15 years ago, 20 years ago, when I was beginning to do research myself, and I was interested in similar kinds of issues of inequality, I had to say I was interested in housing and housing reform because it was legitimate. But there was a way to study this, and other people followed, that got to core questions, but in a form that was politically acceptable. And I suppose in the Brazilian case, and probably people will find such ways, that is, they're really going to study this, but they'll find the way to study it that doesn't look like it's attacking the regime. But the other possibility is that the outsider, and I was, of course, in the Chinese case, very much the outsider, could come in and find ways to support that that made a difference. And I'm sure this is true. There's so much stronger a Brazilian studies community in the United States and Europe that's available to bypass. And I don't think you need the Ford Foundation or the Something Foundation. I think that there's enough of a critical mass in the academy to push things forward in the worst case. Is that too optimistic? Do people think that's too optimistic? Because I don't know Brazil. I don't know this guy, so I just wonder, how many people think that's too optimistic? How many people think the sky is falling? Thank you.
Okay, I would like to propose that we take a 7-minute break to think about this and convene back at 3 for our next panel. Thank you.